Mr. Kendall, I'd like to start by asking you to say a brief piece about yourself.
Okay, I'm 68 years old. I was born in 1930 in Smith Center, Kansas, about the geographic center of the United States. I lived through much of the Depression. The stock market crash was a year before I was born, so most of what happened very early in my life, and I began remembering things in the 1934, 35, and after that. I'm a retired professor from the University of Florida, and I've been living in Gainesville for about 24 years.
Okay, to start with, Mr. Kendall, what is the first thing you can remember about the Depression affecting your life?
It's kind of mixed up with the Dust Bowl. The central United States was having a very severe drought at the same time as the Depression, so a lot of my impressions mix those two things together. A lot of people were suffering for want of food and income. Jobs were very scarce. Food was scarce because it wasn't easy to produce in the drought. I remember distinctly that my parents, who lived on a farm about 6 miles outside town, had succeeded in raising a crop of green beans, string beans, probably 2 or 3 acres of string beans. And we passed the word around that we had string beans to sell, and people would drive for miles and miles because there were no string beans anywhere else. So the Depression made money very scarce, but the drought made food very scarce.
Okay. The Depression caused agricultural families like yours to suffer great economic loss in general. Can you tell us a little about how you and your family coped with this?
We lived on a farm, as I mentioned, just outside town, about 6 miles. It's 160 acres. About half of it was in permanent pasture, and the rest was cultivated, hay and corn and green beans and other things of that sort. But when we were unable to raise crops, let alone sell anything that we might raise, there was so much scarcity of money that prices were very low. Sometimes it was cheaper to burn your crop. I remember we burned corn sometimes because corn was cheaper than coal. And eventually people began leaving their farms, moving away, moving to town, moving to Colorado. Our next door neighbor moved to Colorado. Other people just moved away because they couldn't make a living on the farms. My dad moved to town and started a house moving business. A lot of people would move their farmhouses into town, and he thought that would be a good way to make money. He bought the equipment to move the houses into town. But even people who were moving their farmhouse into town didn't have money to pay for it. So there really wasn't much of a future in that as he had thought there would be. And that was characteristic. People just couldn't make a living doing what they had traditionally done and had to leave, go somewhere else and try to make a living elsewhere.
Okay. The Depression affected nearly all citizens of the United States. The degree of the effect varied. Did you know any people who were worse off than you and your family during the Depression?
Yes, there were quite a number of people worse off than we were. Our family always had a good deal of pride that we would never go on welfare, or it didn't call it welfare in those days. There were government programs to help people who didn't have jobs, such as the WPA and CCC. That's the Workers' Progress Administration, and Civilian Conservation Corps. The WPA was for working men, and it gave them jobs taking care of counting roads and things of that sort. WPA workers built bridges and public works of various kinds, but the feeling was that anybody that went on WPA wasn't very good. Wasn't a very good worker, didn't have a lot of sense, and they claimed that people were on WPA leaned on their shovels, so you could always tell because their shovel handles were bent. The CCC were young people, teenagers, who did projects like create state parks and national parks and build buildings for parks and that sort of thing. A lot of campgrounds now were built by the CCC in the 1930s, and we're still using them.
Okay. As food was in short supply during much of the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl, what kinds of food did your family eat, and where did you get it?
With the Depression, cash was not available. We live in a money economy where we buy everything and pay money for it. But when there isn't any money, people resort to barter economy. They trade things. Something they have, they trade for something they need. And a lot of people did barter for what they needed. They would trade their neighbors for chickens. They had some corn, and they would trade for this or that. And families would help each other. I think probably a lot of the food that we ate came from my grandparent, or from my grandparents. They would butcher a hog or a cow and give us some of the meat. A lot of what we ate, we didn't eat very well. I remember my mother was embarrassed to show a picture of me with a very extended stomach when I was probably about 5 or 6. That was indication that I didn't get enough to eat. A lot of our meals were biscuits and gravy made from bacon that was from a hog that we had butchered, and my mother fried the bacon, and then in the grease would add flour and water and make gravy, and then make biscuits, and we would have biscuits and gravy. A lot of times that was the only meal we had. I remember neighbors down the street were even worse off than we. We had a cow and chickens, and so we had eggs and milk. And my mother knew that the neighbor kids there were some just my age who played together a lot. And she knew that they didn't get enough milk, so in order to get some milk down this boy who was just my age, she would bet him that he couldn't drink a whole glass of milk without taking a breath. And of course, he would jump to the challenge and gulp down a whole glass of milk without taking a breath. We always had enough milk for our family, but a lot of our neighbors didn't.
Many causes have been speculated for the economic difficulties of the Great Depression. Did people during the Depression speculate on its cause, and if so, what were some popular explanations?
The most obvious was that banks closed. And so big business and banks were blamed by most people for the Depression. Uh, we had a banker in our family. My mother's aunt had married a banker, and he suffered a lot of abuse because people thought that he, as a banker, was the cause of all the trouble. But it really wasn't his fault. When people didn't have money, they didn't put deposits in the bank. They drew the deposits out of the bank, and the bank often was ruined or didn't have enough money in deposits to cover the loans that it had made. So a lot of banks closed or went out of business because they couldn't, their balance couldn't keep up with the demand. But people speculated all kinds of things as the reason. Big business and the bank failures were what most people cited. One of my heroes has always been Sam Rayburn, who was Speaker of the House of Representatives. He was a farm boy from Texas and was the author of the Securities and Exchange Law, largely because his parents had been swindled out of their farm by a railroad corporation that made loans and then foreclosed and took people's farms. And so he established the Securities and Exchange Commission, which requires that any exchange of money, investments, loans, that sort of thing, be disclosed, so people who make loans or who make mortgages or get a mortgage on their house know what the story really is. And that was an important step to avoid depressions in the future. I've come to realize that the real cause of depression is, well, according to a recent Economist article, that people lose confidence in government and in the institutions, the banks and the mortgage houses and whatnot. And the Economist says that the cause of depression is the failure of government to establish policies that keep depressions from happening. There are a lot of laws in effect now that I believe will keep depressions from happening, although the Economist also says that much of the world is already in the throes of depression, which means simply that people think that the prices of things are going to go down, and so they hold off buying, and pretty soon nobody's buying anything and nobody has any money. Government can forestall that by establishing policies that reinforce or encourage people to believe that the economy will be sound and that there will not be a depression. A lot of the foreign countries have failed to do that. I think the United States has avoided depression because we've had policies that keep people from making that assumption.
So what were your and your family's explanations for the Depression at the time it was actually happening?
Well, nobody really knew. Many people expressed their frustration by blaming the banks and big business, but and newspapers, political cartoons would reinforce that too. But nobody knew. That was the biggest problem. As Franklin Roosevelt, who's been quoted on television just recently, said the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. People were afraid. They didn't know who to be afraid of or what to be afraid of, and it was the fear that drove the Depression. And that was really a very telling comment that changed a lot of people's attitudes.